Tides of Survival by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1, Arrival in Paradise. The plane's engines hummed steadily as Emily stared out of the small oval window, the endless stretch of turquoise ocean below giving way to specks of lush green islands. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, marveling at the sight. This was supposed to be a fresh start for her family, or at least that's what her mother kept saying. Reconnect as a family, her mother had said with that tight smile of hers, as if repeating it often enough would make it true. Emily wasn't sure how reconnecting worked when her parents barely acknowledged her interests. Almost there! Her mother's voice broke her thoughts. Maggie was dressed in a crisp linen shirt and oversized sunglasses, looking more like a catalog model than someone on a family vacation. Emily gave her a weak smile and turned back to the window. 3 rows back, Aidan wrestled with the armrest, trying to claim it from his dad. "Give it up, old man. It's mine," he said with a grin. Tom chuckled, his large, calloused hand pressing Aidan's back into his seat. "You'll have plenty of armrests where we're going, kid. Sit tight." Aidan rolled his eyes and slumped down, tugging the bill of his baseball cap lower over his eyes. This trip had been his mom's idea, a chance to escape the constant stress of caring for his younger brother, Joey. Aidan loved his brother, but he'd secretly been excited to get away for a while. The guilt gnawed at him, though, every time he thought about how much his parents had sacrificed to make this vacation happen. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Nadi. Local time is 3:45 p.m. The weather is sunny and warm, perfect for the start of your tropical getaway." Aidan glanced out the window, the sight of palm-fringed beaches and sparkling water stirring an unexpected thrill. Maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all. The families spilled out of the airport into the humid Fijian air, their bags piled high on trolleys. The resort shuttle waited just beyond the doors, its bright logo promising paradise. Emily's father, Richard, barked instructions to the driver about their luggage while Maggie fumbled with her phone, trying to get a signal. "Come on, Mom, you don't need Wi-Fi right now," Emily muttered. Maggie frowned, but tucked the phone away. "I just need to make sure everything's okay at the office." Emily rolled her eyes and trudged toward the shuttle, clutching her backpack. She spotted Aidan boarding with his family and caught his eye for a moment. He nodded at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. She looked away quickly, embarrassed. By the time they arrived at the resort, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a golden glow. The sound of waves crashing against the shore greeted them as they stepped out of the shuttle. The resort was breathtaking. Bungalows perched on stilts over the water, hammocks swaying between palm trees, and staff offering chilled drinks with wide smiles. "Now this is what I'm talking about," Aidan said, nudging his dad. His mom, Beth, took Joey's hand, helping him navigate the uneven stone pathway leading to their room. Aidan caught sight of Emily again as she wandered toward the beach with her camera. He hesitated for a moment before following her. Emily knelt in the sand, snapping photos of the shoreline. Aidan walked up, hands stuffed in his pockets. "You a photographer or something?" Startled, Emily looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Not really, just a hobby." Aidan shrugged. "Cool. I'm Aidan, by the way." "Emily," she said, standing and brushing the sand off her knees. "Nice to meet you, Emily," Aidan said, his grin widening. "Bet you can't take a picture that makes me look good." Emily raised an eyebrow. "That's a challenge I'm not sure I'm up for." Aidan laughed, and for the first time since the trip began, Emily felt herself relax. Maybe this vacation wouldn't be as bad as she'd feared. That night, as the stars blanketed the sky, the resort came alive with music and laughter. Emily and Aidan sat at opposite ends of the outdoor dining area, their families immersed in conversations. But every now and then, their eyes would meet, a silent acknowledgement of their shared curiosity about one another. Neither of them could have imagined how drastically their lives would change in the days to come. Chapter 2. Disaster Strikes. The morning sun poured over the island, bathing the resort in hues of gold and crimson. Emily woke early, the soft rustling of the waves pulling her from her dreams. She grabbed her camera and tiptoed out of the bungalow, careful not to wake her parents. The resort was still, save for the occasional chirp of birds and the faint whisper of the breeze. Down on the beach, she captured the first rays of sunlight breaking over the horizon. She could feel the sand cool beneath her feet as the tide crept forward. This was her haven, quiet moments where she didn't have to worry about meeting anyone's expectations. Not far away, Aidan jogged down the beach, earbuds in, his sneakers pounding the sand. He spotted Emily perched on a piece of driftwood, camera in hand, and slowed his pace. "You're always up early, huh?" he said, pulling out his earbuds. Emily turned, surprised to see him. "And you're always jogging. Do you ever take a break?" Aidan smirked. "This is my break." They exchanged a few words before falling into a companionable silence, the sound of the ocean filling the gaps. But their peace was short-lived. The ground trembled beneath their feet. It started subtly, almost like a low grumble, but quickly turned violent. Emily stumbled, grabbing the driftwood to steady herself. "What the hell is that?" Aidan shouted, eyes wide. The earth groaned as trees swayed and birds erupted from the treetops. The ocean pulled back unnaturally far, revealing a stretch of exposed seabed dotted with coral and stranded fish. Emily froze, staring at the receding water. She'd read about this before. "Aidan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a tsunami." Aidan looked at her, his face pale. "We need to run." Panic rippled through the resort as guests and staff realized what was happening. Shouts filled the air, mingling with the distant roar of the approaching wave. Emily and Aidan sprinted toward the main building, weaving through chaos. People were shouting instructions, but the urgency drowned out coherence. Emily spotted her parents near the pool, waving frantically. Her mother screamed her name, but before Emily could reach them, the wall of water appeared on the horizon. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. A massive, churning wall of water surged forward, devouring everything in its path. "Emily!" Maggie shouted, her voice lost in the cacophony. "Come on!" Aidan grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward higher ground. Her legs felt like lead, her mind reeling. She looked back one last time, catching a glimpse of her parents as the wave swallowed the resort. The wave hit with a deafening roar, tearing apart bungalows, trees, and anything in its way. Emily and Aidan scrambled up a rocky incline, the water surging dangerously close behind them. Emily's lungs burned as she climbed, her camera bouncing against her chest. Aidan pushed her forward. "Keep going," he yelled, his voice raw with urgency. They barely made it to a ledge as the water slammed into the rocks below, spraying them with salt and debris. Emily collapsed, gasping for breath, her hands trembling. Aidan leaned against the rock, his chest heaving. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded, though tears streamed down her face. "My parents," she choked out, her voice breaking. "We'll find them," Aidan said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Hours passed as they sat on the ledge, watching the water recede. The once lush resort was now a wasteland of debris and destruction. The air smelled of salt and mud, and the cries of distant survivors echoed in the stillness. "We have to go down," Aidan said finally, his voice steady but grim. Emily shook her head. "What if the water comes back? We can't stay here. If we don't move, no one's going to find us." Reluctantly, Emily followed him down the rocks, her heart pounding with every step. They picked their way through the wreckage, calling out for survivors. As they moved, the enormity of the disaster became clear. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and fragments of lives lay scattered across the landscape. They found no sign of their families, only strangers huddled together, their faces etched with shock and despair. Aidan clenched his fists. "We're not going to give up. Not yet." Emily nodded, clutching her camera tightly as if it were a lifeline. The island they had once seen as paradise was now unrecognizable, a stark reminder of nature's power. They were alone, but together they would face whatever came next. Chapter 3: The Aftermath. The air hung heavy with salt, mud, and smoke as Emily and Aidan moved cautiously through the wreckage. The lush paradise they had arrived in just days ago was now a desolate wasteland. Fragments of bungalows, overturned chairs, and broken palm trees lay scattered across the sand. Here and there, survivors clung to scraps of debris or wandered aimlessly, their faces pale and hollow. Emily's feet sank into the wet sand with every step. Her camera, dangling from its strap, felt heavier than ever, a painful reminder of the life she'd been so eager to document just yesterday. "Emily, over here," Aidan called, his voice cutting through the eerie quiet. He stood near a pile of driftwood and tangled metal, waving her over. "I think there's someone under this." Emily hurried to his side, her heart pounding. Together, they started pulling away the debris, their hands raw and trembling. A man's face emerged, streaked with dirt but alive. "Help," he whispered weakly. "We've got you," Aidan said, his tone firm but kind. He slipped his arms under the man's shoulders, dragging him free. Emily grabbed the man's legs, helping as best she could. Once he was clear, they propped him against a large piece of wood. "Thank you," the man gasped. "My wife, she was just here." Aidan glanced at Emily, his jaw tightening. "We'll keep looking. Stay here, okay? Help will come." The man nodded, his eyes glazed with shock. Emily handed him a bottle of water she'd found earlier, her hands shaking as she unscrewed the cap. She couldn't bring herself to tell him that help might be a long time coming. They pressed on, calling out for survivors as they picked their way through the debris. Emily's throat felt raw from shouting, but she couldn't stop. Every cry for help could be her parents. Every shadow in the wreckage could be them. "Mom, Dad," she yelled, her voice cracking. "Can you hear me?" The only response was the distant crash of waves. "Emily," Aidan said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder, "we'll find them, but we need to keep moving." She nodded, biting her lip to keep the tears at bay. They had to keep moving. They had to. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Emily wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, smearing mud across her skin. Aidan seemed unfazed, his focus unwavering as he scanned the horizon. "Look," he said suddenly, pointing toward a cluster of survivors gathered near what remained of the resort's main building. "Let's check there." They approached cautiously, their hearts pounding with a mix of hope and dread. A group of about 10 people huddled together, some sitting on broken pieces of furniture, others standing and staring blankly into the distance. Most were injured, cuts, bruises, and broken limbs telling the story of their escape. "Excuse me," Aidan said, stepping forward. "Have you seen these people?" He held up a soggy photo of his family, one he'd managed to grab from his wallet before the wave hit. The survivors shook their heads silently, their eyes dull. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling. "My parents, Richard and Maggie, they were near the pool when the wave hit. Did anyone see them?" A woman with a bloodied bandage wrapped around her head looked up. "I saw people running toward the trees," she said weakly. "Near the pool, but I don't know what happened after." Emily's heart leapt. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the woman's hand. "Thank you." They set off again, heading toward the area the woman had described. The ground grew steeper as they climbed toward the forested hills, the landscape littered with uprooted trees and smashed vehicles. "We should stop and rest," Aidan said after a while, his voice strained. "We can't keep going like this." Emily shook her head. "What if they're just over the next hill? What if they need us?" Aidan sighed. "I get it, Emily. I do. But if we collapse, we're not helping anyone." Reluctantly, she sat down on a fallen log, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Aidan handed her a protein bar he'd scavenged from a broken vending machine, and she took it without a word. For a while, they sat in silence, the enormity of the situation pressing down on them like the humid air. "Do you think they're okay?" Emily asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Aidan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think they're strong, and I think we have to keep believing that." Emily nodded, clutching the camera in her lap. She didn't trust herself to speak. As the sun began to set, they reached the edge of the forest. The shadows stretched long and eerie, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Aidan scanned the area, his brow furrowed. "This is where she said they were heading," he murmured. "Let's spread out a bit, but stay close." Emily nodded, stepping carefully over fallen branches and tangled roots. Her heart raced with every step, every rustle of leaves making her jump. "Mom? Dad?" she called softly. "Are you here?" A sudden movement caught her eye, a flash of color among the trees. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Aidan," she whispered, "over here." He was at her side in an instant, his eyes sharp. Together, they pushed through the undergrowth, emerging into a small clearing. And there, lying among the debris, was someone they recognized. Chapter 4: Survival Instincts. Emily's breath hitched as she stepped closer to the figure in the clearing. A woman lay tangled in the undergrowth, her clothes torn and muddy. Her face was bruised, but her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. It wasn't her mother, but it was someone alive. "Hey, can you hear me?" Aidan knelt beside the woman, gently shaking her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, and she winced as she tried to sit up. "Don't move too much," Emily said, crouching beside Aidan. "You're hurt." The woman looked at them through glassy eyes. "My name's Priya," she rasped. I was staying near the beach when it hit. I don't know how I got here." Aidan handed her a bottle of water, and she drank greedily, coughing between sips. "Thank you," she murmured. "Are there others?" "We're looking for our families," Emily said. "You're the first person we've found alive out here." Priya nodded weakly. "I'm a marine biologist. I was working on a coral reef restoration project here. The wave, it's worse than I imagined." "Can you walk?" Aidan asked. Priya winced as she shifted her leg, revealing a deep gash along her calf. "I don't think so." Emily's stomach churned at the sight of the wound, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We need to clean that," she said, pulling a small first aid kit from her bag. She poured water over the wound to flush out the dirt, her hands shaking. "You're good at this," Aidan said, watching her work. Emily managed a tight smile. "My dad made me take a first aid course last summer. I thought it was a waste of time." "Looks like he was right," Aidan said, earning a small laugh from Priya despite her pain. With Priya unable to walk, they fashioned a makeshift stretcher from fallen branches and pieces of fabric torn from Aidan's shirt. It was crude, but it worked. Aidan took the lead, carrying the bulk of the weight, while Emily held the back. They moved slowly through the forest, the dense foliage offering some shade from the relentless sun. Priya directed them toward a higher area she remembered from her fieldwork, a spot that might provide better shelter and a view of the surrounding terrain. "What's your story?" Priya asked, her voice faint but curious. Emily hesitated, unsure how much to say. "We were on vacation with our families," she said finally. "Aidan and I only met a few days ago." "And now you're saving lives together," Priya said with a small smile. "Life has a strange way of throwing people together." Aidan grunted as he adjusted his grip on the stretcher. "Yeah, well, I'd rather it didn't involve tsunamis." By late afternoon, they reached the spot Priya had described, a rocky outcrop overlooking the devastated coastline. From here, they could see the scale of the destruction. The resort was nothing more than rubble, and the surrounding villages were submerged under muddy water. Emily's knees buckled as she took in the sight. Aidan steadied her, his expression grim. "We're going to find them," he said firmly. "We have to." Priya sat propped against a rock, her face pale but determined. "The ocean will recede eventually," she said, "but the damage is done. It could take weeks, months for proper help to arrive." Emily clenched her fists. "We don't have weeks. My parents could be out there now, hurt or worse." "Then we need to focus on surviving," Priya said gently. "If we don't take care of ourselves, we won't be able to help anyone else." The trio scavenged what they could from the area. A few coconuts, scattered debris that could serve as tools, and a tarp Priya recognized as part of her research equipment. Aidan started a small fire using flint he'd found, his Boy Scout training finally coming in handy. As night fell, they huddled together under the tarp, the fire casting flickering shadows on the rocks. The sound of the ocean, once soothing, now felt ominous. "What do you think happened to everyone?" Emily whispered, staring into the flames. Aidan poked at the fire with a stick. "Some probably made it to higher ground. Others—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Priya sighed. "Tsunamis are unpredictable. Sometimes they hit harder in one area and spare another. All we can do is keep looking and stay alive." Emily nodded, though a lump formed in her throat. She clutched her camera like a talisman, its weight grounding her in the chaos. That night, Emily dreamed of the wave, its monstrous height, the deafening roar, the way it swallowed everything in its path. She woke with a start, her heart racing. Aidan was sitting by the fire, his silhouette framed by the faint glow. "Can't sleep?" he asked without looking at her. "Not really," she admitted, sitting beside him. "You?" "Too much to think about," he said. He glanced at her, his expression softening. "We'll find them, Emily. Your parents, my family. We'll find them." She nodded, wanting to believe him. "Thanks, Aidan." For a moment they sat in silence, the fire crackling softly. Despite everything, Emily felt a small spark of hope. They had survived this far. Maybe they could keep going. Chapter 5. Old Wounds. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the rocky outcrop where Emily, Aidan, and Priya had spent the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air carried a damp chill. Emily rubbed her arms as she sat up, her muscles aching from the previous day's efforts. Aidan was already awake, pacing near the edge of the outcrop, scanning the horizon. He'd barely slept, his focus fixed on the distant wreckage and the slim hope of finding their families. "Anything?" Emily asked, her voice hoarse. He shook his head. "Nothing yet, but we're not giving up." Behind them, Priya stirred, wincing as she tried to move her injured leg. Emily rushed to her side. "Let me check your bandage," she said, unwrapping the makeshift dressing. The gash on Priya's calf was red and swollen, the edges angry with infection. "We need to clean this properly," Emily said, her stomach twisting. Priya gave a weak smile. "We need a lot of things. Antibiotics, clean water, food that isn't coconut." Aidan crouched beside them. "We'll find something. Maybe there's a medical kit in the debris." Emily nodded, but her confidence was starting to waver. The enormity of their situation pressed down on her like the humid air. By mid-morning, they decided to venture further inland in search of supplies and, hopefully, other survivors. Priya managed to hobble along with Aidan's help, though every step was clearly painful. They hadn't gone far when they heard it, a faint rhythmic banging coming from somewhere ahead. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her heart racing. Aidan nodded, motioning for them to stay quiet. They crept forward, pushing through the undergrowth until they reached a small clearing. There, among the wreckage of what looked like a fishing boat, was a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin weathered by the sun. He swung a piece of driftwood against the side of the boat, the sound echoing through the trees. "Hey!" Aidan called out, stepping into the clearing. The man froze, turning sharply toward them. His eyes were wild, his beard unkempt. For a moment, he looked like he might bolt, but then his shoulders sagged and he dropped the driftwood. "Thank God," he said, his voice rough. "I thought I was the only one left." The man introduced himself as Jack Reynolds, a retired military officer who'd been fishing off the coast when the tsunami hit. He had managed to swim to shore and had been surviving on raw fish and rainwater ever since. "Good to see some young faces," Jack said, his voice gruff but warm. "I've been trying to signal anyone who might be nearby, but no luck so far." Aidan explained their situation, and Jack listened intently, his eyes narrowing as they spoke. "You've done well to make it this far," he said. "But if you're going to survive out here, you need to start thinking like soldiers, not tourists." Emily bristled at his tone. "We're doing the best we can." Jack held up a hand. "I'm not criticizing, kid, just saying you need a plan. This island isn't safe." "What do you mean?" Priya asked, her face pale. Jack gestured toward the horizon. "The tsunami wasn't the end of it. The aftershocks could bring more waves, and the longer we stay in one place, the more we risk running into trouble. Wild animals, injuries, dehydration, you name it." Despite her initial irritation, Emily had to admit Jack was right. He immediately took charge, organizing their supplies and showing them how to reinforce their shelter with debris from the forest. He also taught Aidan how to fashion a spear for protection and fishing, his military training proving invaluable. But Jack's no-nonsense attitude rubbed Emily the wrong way. He was blunt to the point of being abrasive, and his insistence on preparing for the worst made her stomach churn. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Emily couldn't hold back any longer. "Why are you so sure nothing good is going to happen?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Jack's expression darkened. "Because I've seen what happens when people aren't ready. I lost my family years ago because I thought we'd be fine. I'm not making that mistake again." The silence that followed was heavy. Emily felt a pang of guilt but couldn't bring herself to apologize. Later, as the fire burned low, Aidan found her sitting on a rock, staring at the stars. "You okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. She sighed. "I don't know. Jack's probably right about everything, but he makes me feel like I'm failing." "You're not," Aidan said firmly. "We wouldn't have made it this far without you. Don't let him get to you." Emily glanced at him, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the fire. "Thanks, Aidan, for everything." He smiled. "We're in this together. No way I'm letting you face this alone." As the group settled in for the night, Jack sat apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Priya watched him thoughtfully before turning to Emily. "People like him carry a lot of weight," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean you have to carry it too." Emily nodded, her mind racing. Jack's past was a mystery, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, and that it might be the key to understanding his harsh demeanor. Chapter 6: Building Bonds. The next morning, the group set out early, the humid air clinging to their clothes as they moved through the dense forest. Jack took the lead, his military instincts sharp. While Aidan carried the makeshift spear Jack had helped him fashion the night before. Priya hobbled along, leaning heavily on Emily for support, her injured legs slowing their pace. "We need to find a water source," Jack said, his tone clipped. "We can't rely on coconuts and rain forever." "What about the streams inland?" Priya suggested. "I studied this island before coming here. There should be freshwater pools in the higher elevations." Jack nodded. "Good. That's our priority." As they walked, the group fell into a rhythm. Emily and Aidan exchanged quiet jokes to lighten the mood, while Priya shared bits of information about the island's ecosystem. Even Jack softened slightly, offering practical tips and the occasional gruff encouragement. For the first time since the tsunami, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. They were working together, relying on each other. Maybe they could survive this. By mid-afternoon, they reached a narrow stream winding through the forest. The water was clear and cold, and the group eagerly filled their bottles and washed their faces. Emily knelt by the edge, cupping her hands to drink, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "This is a good spot," Jack said, scanning the area. "We'll rest here for a while, then move higher up." As the group settled in, Aidan and Emily wandered a short distance from the stream, exploring the surrounding area. The forest was dense but alive with the sounds of birds and insects. Aidan used his spear to poke at the underbrush, pretending to be a fearless hunter. "Careful," Emily teased. "You don't want to scare away all the imaginary prey." Aidan smirked. "Just practicing for when we need to catch dinner. I figure it's only a matter of time before Jack starts handing out survival badges." Emily laughed, the sound lightening the weight on her chest. For a moment, she almost forgot the devastation they'd left behind. Their light-hearted moment was shattered by a sudden guttural growl. Emily froze, her heart leaping into her throat as the bushes ahead rustled violently. "What was that?" she whispered, gripping Aidan's arm. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. He raised the spear, his knuckles white. The growl came again, louder this time, and a pair of yellow eyes glinted from the shadows. A massive boar burst through the underbrush, its tusks gleaming in the dappled sunlight. "Run!" Aidan shouted, pulling Emily behind him. They bolted back toward the stream, the boar crashing through the forest behind them. Emily's legs burned as she ran, her mind racing. She could hear Aidan shouting, the fear in his voice clear. "Jack! Priya! Get ready!" he yelled. The group by the stream scrambled to their feet as Emily and Aidan burst into view, the boar close on their heels. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed a large branch from the ground and planted himself between the charging animal and the group. "Move to the sides," he barked. "It'll focus on me." Emily and Priya scrambled away, their backs pressed against the trees. Aidan stood frozen, clutching the spear, his eyes wide with fear. "Aidan," Jack shouted, "now's your chance. Aim for the neck." Aidan hesitated, his grip on the spear trembling. The boar lunged at Jack, who sidestepped just in time, slamming the branch against its side. The animal reared back, its snout dripping with froth. "Do it," Jack yelled. Aidan let out a cry and thrust the spear forward, the point sinking into the boar's thick hide. The animal let out a horrific squeal, thrashing wildly as Aidan held on, his arms straining. Jack moved in quickly, driving the branch into the boar's side with all his strength. The animal collapsed with a final grunt, its massive body heaving once before going still. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Aidan dropped the spear, his hands shaking. "You did it," Jack said, clapping Aidan on the shoulder. "That took guts, kid." Aidan nodded, though his face was pale. I didn't want it to hurt anyone." Emily stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "You were amazing," she said softly. "I don't think I could have done that." Aidan managed a weak smile. "Thanks." With the immediate danger past, Jack inspected the boar. "This is a blessing," he said. "We've got fresh meat now." The group worked together to prepare the animal, using pieces of debris to fashion tools. Priya directed from the sidelines, her leg propped up as she explained how to preserve the meat. It was messy, exhausting work, but it gave them a sense of purpose. By the time the sun set, they had a small fire going, the smell of roasting meat filling the air. The group sat around the flames, their exhaustion tempered by the small victory. "To survival," Jack said, raising a piece of roasted boar, "and to Aidan, our fearless hunter." Aidan laughed, the sound breaking through the tension. "I don't know about fearless, but I'll take it." Emily smiled, her heart feeling lighter. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time, it felt like they had a fighting chance. Chapter 7. Danger in the Wild. The fire crackled softly in the pre-dawn darkness, its glow casting flickering shadows on the group. Emily stirred awake, her neck stiff from leaning against a fallen tree. Beside her, Aidan snored softly, his face slack with exhaustion. Jack sat on a nearby rock, sharpening a makeshift knife with methodical precision, his eyes scanning the forest for movement. "Morning," Emily said groggily, pushing herself upright. Jack nodded but didn't look away from the tree line. "We're moving at first light. This spot's too exposed." Emily glanced at Priya, who was still sleeping, her injured legs stretched out beside her. "She's not going to make it far like this," Emily said quietly. Jack sighed, his shoulders tense. "I know, but staying here isn't an option. We'll rig a better stretcher. It's going to be hard, but we don't have a choice." Emily wanted to argue but couldn't. The wilds weren't just dangerous. They were merciless. The boar attack had proven that. As the sun rose, the group broke camp. Aidan and Jack worked together to construct a sturdier stretcher for Priya, using vines and branches they'd gathered. Emily helped pack their meager supplies, her hands trembling slightly as she tied knots. The strain of the past few days was beginning to show. "Here," Aidan said, handing her a piece of roasted boar wrapped in a banana leaf. "You should eat." Emily took it, offering a faint smile. "Thanks." "We're going to be okay," Aidan said, his tone steady. "We just have to keep moving." Emily nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. The island was vast, and every step seemed to take them farther from hope. By midday, the heat was oppressive. Sweat dripped down their faces as they trudged through the dense forest, the stretcher swaying precariously between Aidan and Jack. Priya bit her lip to keep from crying out, her leg throbbing with every jolt. "Let's stop for a minute," Emily said, her voice strained. She gestured toward a shaded area beneath a cluster of palm trees. "We need a break." Jack hesitated but eventually nodded. 5 minutes, no more. As they rested, Emily wandered a short distance from the group, drawn by the sound of running water. She found a narrow stream trickling over rocks and knelt beside it, splashing cool water on her face. The relief was immediate, and she filled her bottle, letting out a shaky breath. "Hey, don't go too far," Aidan called, appearing behind her. "I won't," she replied, handing him the bottle. "Here, you look like you need this." Aidan grinned and took a long sip. "Thanks." Their brief moment of calm was shattered by a sudden blood-curdling scream. They spun around, their hearts racing. "That was Priya," Emily gasped. They sprinted back to the clearing, their stomachs twisting with fear. Jack stood over Priya, his knife drawn, his eyes darting wildly. Behind him, a snake as thick as a man's arm slithered through the underbrush, its scales glinting in the sunlight. "Stay back!" Jack barked, positioning himself between the snake and Priya. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The snake coiled, its head raised, its forked tongue flicking out as it sized up its prey. "Jack, what do we do?" Aidan asked, gripping his spear tightly. "Keep it distracted," Jack growled. "And don't miss." Aidan nodded, his knuckles white around the spear. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes locked on the snake. The creature hissed, its body shifting like liquid metal as it prepared to strike. "Come on," Aidan muttered under his breath. "Come on." The snake lunged, its jaws wide, and Aidan thrust the spear forward with all his strength. The point struck true, piercing the snake's neck. It thrashed violently, its tail whipping through the air, but Jack moved in swiftly, driving his knife into its skull. The forest fell silent as the snake went limp, its body collapsing in a heap. Aidan let out a shaky laugh, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. "2 for 2, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Jack clapped him on the shoulder, a rare smile breaking through his stern demeanor. Good work, kid. The group worked quickly to ensure the snake posed no further threat, dragging its body away from the camp. Priya was shaken but unharmed, though the incident left them all on edge. As they resumed their journey, Emily fell into step beside Aidan. "You're getting pretty good at this survival thing," she said, her tone light. "Not exactly the life skills I thought I'd need," he replied, grinning. "But I guess it's better than nothing." Emily smiled, grateful for his optimism. Despite everything, Aidan had a way of making her feel like they could overcome anything. As night fell, they found shelter in a rocky alcove, the walls providing some protection from the elements. Jack set up a fire while Emily and Aidan gathered what little food they could find. Priya rested against the rocks, her face pale but determined. "We're making progress," Jack said as they sat around the fire. "If we keep this pace, we'll reach the higher ground by tomorrow." "And then what?" Emily asked, her voice quiet. "What happens if we don't find anyone else?" Jack's expression softened, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "Then we keep surviving. That's all we can do." As the fire crackled, the group shared stories, fragments of their lives before the tsunami. Jack spoke of his time in the military, of the family he'd lost, and the lessons he'd learned. Priya shared tales of her research, her passion for the ocean, evident despite her exhaustion. When it was Aidan's turn, he hesitated, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I just want to see my family again," he said finally. "My brother Joey, he's autistic. He needs me." Emily reached over, squeezing his hand. "We'll find them," she said softly. "We have to." For the first time in days, Aidan allowed himself to believe her. Chapter 8: Decisions and Sacrifices. The sky was an ominous shade of gray as the group climbed higher into the hills, the oppressive heat giving way to a cool, unsettling breeze. The forest was thinner here, the ground rocky and uneven. Every step was a struggle, especially for Priya, whose injured leg made even the slightest incline feel like a mountain. "We're almost there," Jack said, though his tone betrayed his own wariness. He carried Priya's stretcher single-handedly, his face set in a grim determination. Aidan followed close behind, carrying their remaining supplies. Emily lagged slightly, her camera bouncing against her chest. She'd barely used it since the tsunami, but the weight of it felt oddly comforting, like an anchor to the world they'd left behind. As they rounded a bend, Jack stopped abruptly, raising a hand to silence them. "Listen," he said. The group froze, straining to hear. At first, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of voices. "People," Emily whispered, her heart leaping. Jack narrowed his eyes. "Stay alert. We don't know who they are." They followed the voices cautiously, their footsteps muffled on the rocky ground. As they crested a ridge, they spotted a small encampment nestled in a clearing below. A makeshift shelter had been constructed from tarps and driftwood, and a thin column of smoke rose from a fire. A group of 3 men sat around the fire, their clothes tattered and their faces gaunt. They didn't look hostile, but there was a desperation in their movements that made Emily's stomach twist. Jack turned to the group. "Stay back. I'll go first." "No," Aidan said firmly. "We should go together. They're just people like us, right?" Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but let me do the talking." As they approached the camp, the men looked up sharply, their expressions wary. One of them, a wiry man with a scruffy beard, stood, gripping a sharpened stick. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Survivors," Jack said evenly. "Like you." The man's eyes darted to the others, then back to Jack. "Like you have supplies?" "Not much," Jack replied, "but we're not here to take anything. We're looking for help and information." The man hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Come closer," slowly. The tension eased slightly as the group sat around the fire, though the men's guarded expressions never softened. They introduced themselves as locals who had been fishing when the tsunami struck. They'd lost everything and had been living off scraps ever since. "Have you seen anyone else?" Emily asked, her voice hopeful. "Families, maybe? My parents?" The wiry man shook his head. "No one. Just us." Emily's heart sank, but she forced herself to stay composed. As the conversation continued, it became clear the men were in dire straits. Their food supply was nearly gone, and one of them was nursing a deep wound that looked badly infected. "We're not going to last much longer out here," one of them admitted, his voice breaking. "The ocean's taken everything." Jack's jaw tightened. "You need to move inland. There's higher ground further up, better chances of finding clean water and resources." The men exchanged glances. "We've tried," the wiry man said, "but we can't carry him." He gestured to the injured man, who sat slumped against the shelter, his face pale. Later, as they huddled a short distance from the camp, Jack addressed the group. "We can't stay here. If we help them, it'll slow us down. Priya's already struggling." "We can't just leave them," Emily said, her voice rising. "They're people. They need us. And so do our families," Jack shot back. "We have limited resources. If we stretch ourselves too thin, none of us are making it out of here." Aidan clenched his fists. "There has to be a way. Maybe we can leave them some supplies, enough to hold them over." "We don't have enough for ourselves," Jack snapped. The group fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. In the end, they agreed to share what little food they had and show the men a safer route inland. Jack made it clear they couldn't take on the injured man, though the decision sat heavily on all of them. As they left the camp, Emily glanced back, her chest tight. She couldn't shake the man's hollow eyes, the silent plea for help they'd been forced to ignore. "Did we do the right thing?" she asked Aidan quietly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we did the best we could." That night, as they camped on a rocky ledge, the group was quieter than usual. Even Jack seemed subdued, his usual stoicism cracking under the strain. "We can't save everyone," he said finally, his voice low, "but we have to keep going. That's the only way we'll survive." No one responded, but his words lingered in the air, a bitter reminder of the harsh reality they faced. Chapter 9, Reunion. The morning light was cold and thin as the group resumed their climb. The higher they went, the more the forest gave way to jagged rocks and open skies. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint smell of salt and damp earth. For hours they moved in near silence, each step a painful reminder of their dwindling strength. Emily's legs felt like lead, her back aching from the constant strain. She kept her focus on Aidan's steady pace ahead of her, his broad shoulders a source of quiet reassurance. "Just a little further," Jack said, though he sounded less sure with each passing hour. The group pressed on, driven by a mix of hope and desperation. And then, as they crested a ridge, Emily saw it, a small encampment sprawled across a plateau below. Her heart leapt. Tents flapped in the wind, and the faint hum of voices carried up to them. Smoke rose from several small fires, and people moved between the shelters. It wasn't much, but it was civilization. "There's a camp," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Do you think—" "We'll find out," Jack said, his expression unreadable. "Let's go." As they approached the camp, a man in a faded orange vest stepped forward, his face weathered but kind. He carried a clipboard and a radio strapped to his chest, looking every bit the part of a rescue worker. "You're survivors?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Jack nodded. "We've been making our way inland since the tsunami. There are more people out there, scattered, injured." The man's expression softened. "You're lucky to have made it this far. Come with me. We'll get you food, water, and medical attention." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat as the group followed him. The camp was a patchwork of tarps and salvaged materials, but it was organized. Volunteers moved between tents, carrying supplies and tending to the injured. After they were seated and given bowls of warm soup, the man returned with a clipboard. "We're trying to reunite families as best we can," he explained. "Names and descriptions help us cross-reference survivors." Emily's pulse quickened. "My parents, Richard and Maggie Taylor, they were at the resort when the wave hit." The man nodded, jotting down the names. "We've had a lot of people come through. It might take some time to check." "My dad, Tom O'Connor," Aidan said quickly, "and my mom, Beth, and my little brother, Joey. He's autistic." The man's pen paused midair. "Joey O'Connor," he said slowly. "We found a boy matching that description yesterday. He was with a group of survivors further inland." Aidan's breath caught. "He's alive, are you sure?" The man nodded. "He's here. I'll take you to him." Aidan practically sprinted through the camp, the man struggling to keep up. Emily followed close behind, her heart pounding. She'd never seen Aidan look so focused, so vulnerable. They reached a small tent near the edge of the camp. Inside, a boy sat cross-legged, his hands busy arranging small stones into patterns on the ground. His hair was a tangled mess, but his face was unmistakable. "Joey," Aidan choked out, dropping to his knees. The boy looked up, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Aidan," he cried, scrambling to his feet. Aidan pulled Joey into a tight hug, his shoulders shaking as he buried his face in his brother's hair. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. "I thought." Joey clung to him, his small hands gripping Aidan's shirt. "I was scared," he said softly, "but the people here helped me." Emily watched from the doorway, tears streaming down her face. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Priya, her own expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Sometimes we get lucky," Priya said quietly. As night fell, the group gathered around a fire in the center of the camp. Aidan stayed close to Joey, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. For the first time in days, Aidan looked at peace. "What about your parents?" Jack asked Emily. "They're still out there," she said softly. "But if Aidan found Joey, maybe we'll find them," Jack said firmly. "This camp is a good start. They'll come here if they can." Emily nodded, though a pang of doubt lingered in her chest. She couldn't shake the fear that they might never arrive. The next morning, Emily was sitting near the edge of the camp, gazing out at the horizon, when she heard her name. "Emily?" She turned sharply, her heart stopping as she saw her parents standing a few feet away. Her mother looked pale but unharmed, her father's shirt torn and dirty. "Mom? Dad?" she whispered, her voice breaking. They rushed toward her, wrapping her in their arms. Emily clung to them, the weight of the past days crashing over her like a wave. For the first time since the tsunami, she allowed herself to cry freely. "We thought we'd lost you," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "We looked everywhere." Emily pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I thought I'd lost you too." Her mother cupped her face, her eyes shimmering. "You're so strong, Emily. I'm so proud of you." That night, as the camp settled into a quiet rhythm, Emily and Aidan sat together by the fire. Their families were safe, but the scars of what they'd endured remained. "What happens now?" Emily asked. Aidan shrugged, his gaze fixed on the flames. "We keep going, together." Emily smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they had a chance. Chapter 10. Moving Forward. The days passed slowly in the camp, a strange mixture of relief and sorrow hanging over everything. Survivors reunited with loved ones, while others clung to fading hope. Volunteers worked tirelessly to organize resources and prepare for the long process of rebuilding. For Emily and Aidan, life began to settle into something resembling routine. They helped where they could, distributing supplies, clearing debris, and comforting those who had lost everything. The horrors of the tsunami still lingered in their minds, but the camp offered a fragile sense of stability. One afternoon, Emily sat under a tarp near the edge of the camp, sorting through her camera. She flipped through the photos she'd taken before the disaster. The shimmering waves, the vibrant flowers, and the golden sunsets that had once felt like the most important things in the world. "Are those from before?" Aidan asked, sitting beside her. Emily nodded. "I thought they were the best pictures I'd ever taken. But now," she gestured toward the camp, "it all feels so small compared to what we've been through." Aidan leaned closer, studying the photos. "They're beautiful," he said quietly. "But maybe you're right. Maybe the best pictures are still ahead of you." Emily smiled. "Thanks, I think you might be right." That evening, a meeting was held around the largest fire in the camp. The rescue teams explained their next steps. Larger relief efforts were on the way, but it could take weeks for supplies to reach the more remote areas. "We'll need volunteers to help scout the island for other survivors," one of the team leaders said. "If anyone feels up to it, let us know." Emily felt a nudge from Aidan. "We should go," he said. "Are you serious?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "After everything we've been through, you want to go back out there?" "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "Because there are still people out there who need help, and we know what it's like to be them." Emily hesitated, glancing at her parents. Her mother gave her a small nod, her eyes full of pride. "If you want to do this, we'll support you." Emily turned back to Aidan. "Okay," she said, "let's do it." Over the next few days, Emily and Aidan joined a small team of volunteers preparing for the search. They packed supplies, studied maps, and learned basic first aid techniques from Priya, who had decided to stay at the camp to recover. Be careful out there, Priya said as they prepared to leave. And remember, surviving isn't just about strength, it's about being smart and staying together. Jack approached them as well, his expression unreadable. You've come a long way, he said. I didn't think you'd make it past the first few days, but you proved me wrong. Thanks, Jack, Aidan said. That means a lot. Jack nodded. Just don't get cocky. The wilds don't care how much you've learned. Emily smiled. We'll keep that in mind. On the morning of their departure, Emily and Aidan stood at the edge of the camp, their backpacks heavy but their spirits lighter than they'd been in days. Joey clung to Aidan's side, his eyes wide with worry. Are you coming back? Joey asked. Aidan knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Of course I am. You're my little brother. I'm not going anywhere. Joey nodded, his grip on Aidan's shirt loosening. Okay, be safe. We will, Aidan promised. Emily's parents hugged her tightly, her mother whispering, You're stronger than you know. We'll be here when you get back. As they turned and began their trek into the forest, Emily glanced back at the camp. It felt strange to leave after finding a place of safety, but she knew this was the right choice. They had survived, and now they had a chance to help others do the same. The first day of their journey was grueling but hopeful. Emily found herself looking at the world differently, noticing not just its dangers but also its beauty. The sun filtering through the trees, the calls of distant birds, and even the smell of the damp earth reminded her of how precious life was. You think we'll find anyone? She asked Aidan as they climbed a steep incline. I hope so, he said. But even if we don't, at least we're trying. Emily nodded. She thought of the photos she'd taken before the tsunami, the images frozen in time. She realized now that survival wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about moving forward, step by step. And as they reached the top of the hill, the world stretching out before them, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The end.